Welcome, everyone, to our second public seminar in the course Political Participation, a research dialogue with leading international scholars. My name is Jenny Oser, and I'm an associate professor of politics and government at Ben-Gurion University. I'm also the principal investigator of an ERC project on participation and representation in the digital age. And I'm very honored to introduce our second speaker in this series, Professor Noam Lupu of Vanderbilt University and the American Academy of Berlin. Noam is a leading researcher on comparative political behavior and democratic representation, and his work has been published in all of the leading journals and outlets of political science. Noam's talk today is on the topic of poll workers and the effects of political participation, which is a working paper that analyzes a unique natural experiment in Peru. Before turning to Noam's talk, a few notes on how we'll run this webinar. First, Noam will speak for about a half hour. Second, I'll introduce our panelists who've carefully read Noam's paper and have each prepared questions in advance. And third, we'll select questions that participants write to us in the chat for Noam's response. So during the talk, we welcome you. Send us your questions into the chat for panelists' review. Thank you for joining us. And Noam, the floor is yours.
Thanks so much, Jenny, for the very generous introduction. Thanks everybody for being here and for taking the time to join us. Let me start by sharing the screen. There, I think that should work. Okay. So this is a work in progress in lots of ways, not just as a working paper, but also as part of a broader project. And so I'm very much looking forward to your questions and comments, and also very much open to ideas for where to go next with this particular project, or sort of what questions, follow-on questions to ask in future studies. So this particular paper sort of starts from a set of theories that actually come from normative political theory. And those theories are sort of, normative theorists sort of talk about those theories as, group them as participatory theories of democracy. And you may have already, come across these kinds of theories. But the sort of big takeaway of these theories of participation is that participating in democracy is supposed to lead individuals to a kind of what they would call self-realization, and that participation is supposed to have, it's supposed to shape the way that people think about democracy and make them more democratic in some sort of sense. So Carol Pateman is kind of the among sort of modern normative theorists, most sort of broadly associated with participatory theories of democracy. It's sort of the work draws on Rousseau and Mill and lots of classical theorists, but Pateman is sort of the most prominent modern normative theorist to take this up, and her sort of famous classic book from 1970. Among other things, says the more the individual citizen participates, the better he is able to do so, or she is able to do so, maybe if it were written today. Mason sort of summarizes this a decade and a half later. It's through participation that a democratic community is created and maintained, and this is the important part for me, the capacities of its members enlarged. And then a little bit later, Jenny Mansbridge summarizes the literature saying participation in a democratic polity makes the participants better citizens, right? So there's this kind of general kind of normative notion that participation is going to, have some sort of effects on people's attitudes towards democracy. Although, being normative theory, it's somewhat loose on specifically what they would expect. Now, if we try to take this into the kind of the empirical realm, there is some work on the effects of participation, and that work focuses on certain types of political participation. And for the most part, when empiricists write about political participation, they more or less divide it into two categories. The first kind of participation is what people have come to call deliberative participation. There's a great book on the effects of jury service, for instance, and there's some work on participatory budgeting and those kinds of things. So these are forms of participation where there's some interaction between individuals, and they are tasked with arriving at some sort of decision. Right, it might be non-binding in some participatory budgeting settings, or it might be binding, of course, in sort of jury service. They, arrive at some sort of verdict. The alternative to that in the literature on participation is that forms of participation that are considered expressive. So voting is considered expressive, campaigning, donating to a campaign, right? Sort of an individual behavior doesn't involve interacting with other people. And the goal is to express your political preferences or your political attitudes. Or maybe to, do that in an effort to persuade other people, but you're expressing sort of your own preferences there. So, one thing I wanted to do with this project is to suggest that we're missing a whole class of forms of participation in democratic settings by focusing on these two forms. And I should say that the vast majority of research on the effects of political participation focuses on voting. As does, I think, the vast majority of research in general on democratic participation. So the sort of class of forms of participation that I think we ought to pay more attention to is what I sort of have tentatively called supportive forms of political participation. So these are forms of participation where people are participating in a democratic process, in a political democratic process. They're interacting with state institutions, but they are not asked to express their own preferences, and they're also not asked to arrive at any sort of decision. So you can think about this as kind of stewarding a political process rather than expressing your views or arriving at, deliberating over some sort of decision. Now, I don't want to suggest that these are, that there are sort of hard and fast borders between these types. Of course, there's overlaps, and I'm going to talk about poll workers, and there is potentially some deliberation that happens when poll workers are asked to count, to tally votes. But I think there's a whole set of forms of participation here other than poll workers that take this form. Census takers, when governments are involved in gathering a new census. In some contexts, I think we can think about military service. Yeah, it's confounded, I think, in some contexts, like the Israeli context, by sort of the nature of different forms of experience. But think about military service in South Korea or Switzerland, right? Those forms of military service that are effectively sort of coerced community service. So, stewarding some sort of state activity, but not being asked to sort of, express anything with it. Okay, so if we think about supportive forms of political participation, you know, what would we expect its effects to be on individuals, right? So, and here, I want to go back to those participatory theories of democracy, but also kind of in an effort to, pin down sort of the theoretical foundation. I'll also mention, theories in psychology that we can draw on here. So, the big one for participatory theories of democracy, and this is what Pateman's entire book is about, political efficacy. So that's really the expectation, or, in some cases, I would call it empowerment rather than political efficacy, but she uses the term efficacy. That's the real sort of focus for her, right? So participating in a democratic process makes you feel empowered, makes you feel like you are part of a political system, makes you feel like you're a part of this, democracy. You can think about this in terms of psychology. Self-perception theory is really a set of theories that suggest that when people engage in an activity, they start to think of themselves as someone who is capable of engaging in that activity, right? So, often in psychology, psychologists often think that attitudes drive behavior, but this is a set of theories that suggest that behavior actually drives attitudes, or at least self-perceptions. There's also, I think, more recent participatory theories of democracy, and this is, for instance, where Mansbridge focuses, focus on the perceptions of political institutions and the political system more generally. So the idea here is that if you participate, then you become more supportive of the political system. In the case of poll workers, you might say, okay, they're participating in an electoral process, and so maybe their attitudes towards electoral institutions becomes, shaped by that participation. Again, there's a set of theories in psychology. Procedural fairness theory, I think, sort of makes most sense to me here, where people who observe a process as fair then come to think of that process generally as being fair, right? So this is used, for instance, in studies of jury service and things like that, right? So if you sort of participate in a jury and view that experience as having been a fair one, then you start to think that the justice system more generally is fair. There's also some work, this is now, sort of departing from normative theories, but in the empirical literature, there's some work on the effects of voting that suggests that voting generates more political interest and leads people to gather more political information. There's a really interesting study by Tori Shineman where she pays people to vote in a local election in San Francisco, and as a result of that, they go out and find out, information about different candidates and things like that, right? So you can imagine some sort of effects like that. With the kind of thing that I'm looking at, like being a poll worker, it's not, being a poll worker is a part of a political process, but it's not political explicitly. It's not, partisan in any sort of way. So it may be that, people don't link it with, information about politics per se. The final thing, and this is sort of critical for participatory theories of democracy, especially sort of the classical ones, is that participating makes you more likely to participate later on. And so that's part of this idea of participation makes citizens more democratic, right? If democracy means people participating in the political decision-making process, then what we want is more participation, and participation is going to produce more participation. So participation makes people more democratic in the sense that they're going to participate more. So those are, the sort of basic expectations, I think, that, existing theories would lead us to expect. Okay, so of course, studying this is complicated, like most things, and in particular, the sort of the big issue here is that, as I'm sure you all know, people self-select into participation. So we can't just, ask a bunch of people who volunteered to be poll workers in the U.S. whether or not they like democracy, right? Because you're going to get, certain types of people choosing to do that kind of work, right? So to sort of address that potential issue, I'm going to focus on this natural experiment in Peru. I should mention that it's not unique to Peru. There's a couple of other countries in Latin America that also have sort of similar systems, although there's some variation in the degree of enforcement and things like that. But at least on paper, this isn't something that's entirely unique to Peru. And there's kind of an interesting, I think, research out there, potential for research out there on sort of exactly why Latin American countries have adopted this system for poll workers. And I should say that Spain also has something similar, and I think that's not a coincidence. So this is the basic natural experiment here. So the office that runs elections in Peru, the ONPE, the Office for National Electoral Processes, divides the country into 83,000 precincts, or what I'm sort of translating as precincts. In Spanish, they're called mesas, and they're literally tables at the polling place. So there's a different table for each mesa. Each mesa is about 200 to 300 people assigned to it. And from that set of 200 to 300 people, the ONPE selects 25 citizens at the beginning of the election process, so in advance of the elections. It's not a random 25 people. This has changed over time. It actually used to be random, but more recently they've been picking people specifically who have higher levels of education, people who are younger, and those who haven't served as poll workers in the past. So that's important to keep in mind here as part of the design. Now, of those 25, 3 are then randomly selected to be the poll workers, and each mesa needs to have 3 poll workers to open on election day. And then another 3 who are randomly selected as alternates. Everybody gets notified in advance of the election and gets trained to be able to do this, and that's an important thing to keep in mind. And I can say more about that. And then these people have to do it. Voting is compulsory in Peru, so is serving as a poll worker. And the fines are considerable, and there's quite a high level of compliance. So if you don't pay your fine, you can't access all sorts of government services, or renew your passport, or renew your national ID card, and those kinds of things. So we're talking about, at the end of the day, 250,000 people doing this each time there's an election in Peru. Unfortunately, there's lots of elections in Peru in recent years. There's been lots of turnover of presidents resigning, and early elections and things like that. I'll talk about the case that I'm looking at. But this is a really enormous number of people, and if you talk to, I've presented this in a number of contexts where Peruvians have been in the room, and there's always somebody who's already done this. I mean, it's a large part of the Peruvian population has done this at some point or another. So, which is partly why the ONPE is sort of focusing on younger people these days. But it is a considerable number of people, which to my mind makes it remarkable that we don't study these things. A lot of people do this every time there's an election in every electoral democracy, even if it's not compulsory or randomly selected. So let me say just a couple of things about what they do, and I can say more about this if there are questions, and I'll just run through the list here. And here's I observed the 2018 election in Peru, and this just gives you sort of a visual of what this looks like. So a polling place, this is a polling place in Lima. A polling place is typically a school, and so this is a classroom in a big public school in Lima. So the polling place in this particular polling place has hundreds of mesas in it, and each classroom has two. You can actually see sort of at the very left side of my picture, there's another table that's another mesa. So, but the one that's sort of at the center of this photo is the one that I'm sort of taking a picture of. That's the mesa. To the right of that, you can see there are three women who are sitting there. One of them is on her cell phone. This is before the polls opened. Those are the poll workers. And there's a printer that prints out the ballots, and there's a list for them to check IDs. So voters come into this room, who are assigned to that mesa. They'll check their ID, make sure they're in the right place. They'll give them instructions. They'll give them the ballot. They'll take that ballot to the booth, which is sort of where I'm standing taking this photo. And then they'll return that ballot and put it into that cardboard box that's right behind the printer there. At the end of, so polls are open from 9 in the morning until 6 in the evening, and then whoever's in line at 6 can still vote. So sometimes the place will be open a little bit beyond that, and then the poll workers will tally the votes and fill out a tally sheet, which then goes to the electoral office. So on average, among the people that I surveyed, and I'll say something about the survey, this takes about 12 hours. So again, I'm always struck by there's so much work on voting. Voting in this context is like showing up. There's almost never a line. You go, you get a ballot, you go and you fill it in, and you put it in the box. That's the extent of participation. Whereas this is a full Sunday of going through this process and interacting with people. Seems like a much more intensive form of political participation. Okay, so in the interest of time, I'll sort of skip a little bit of this. I think it's clear the sort of purpose of focusing on this natural experiment is that this is obligatory and there isn't self-selection, and so that sort of helps with measuring causal effects. And I can say more about non-compliance, but I'll sort of leave that for a second. So the context here in the particular study that I was able to do is Peru in 2020. So in the fall of 2019, then President Martín Vizcarra dissolved Congress. This is something that's constitutional in Peru. after a couple of no confidence votes, the president can do this, and he did. And so a new legislature had to be elected, and those elections happened in January. This, image just shows you, so those are all, and they're not even all of them. This is not even an exhaustive list of all the party lists that ran. It's closed list PR elections, very, very fragmented political system, lots and lots of different parties. Okay, so following that election, I, working with the ONPE, did a survey. So what we did was a survey of 750 people who were selected to be poll workers, and at the same time, 750 people who were selected as alternates. And that is basically a simple random sample. It's only stratified by gender, and I don't have that much sort of demographic information on these people from the election office. That was done in February, so following the election. Then there's a re-interview. So this was sort of planned as a panel to see the sort of how any sort of effects, whether or not they last over time. And that was in June of 2020. And so I think everyone here is old enough to remember that in between February and June of 2020, we had a global pandemic start. Peru was in lockdown in June, and actually was in lockdown for a very long time. And Peru was one of the heaviest hit countries in Latin America in March and April of 2020, with a very, very large number of deaths. So we have to keep in mind the June second wave has sort of all sorts of things going on. One of the issues that creates, I think, is a fairly unusually high rate of attrition. I've done other panel surveys, not in Peru, but in other parts of Latin America, and 25% attrition is what I expected. This is quite a bit higher, and it's correlated with the kinds of things that you might expect given the pandemic. So women and parents of young children were more likely to drop out, not respond to their phone, or not agree to take the survey the second time around. So so there's some systematic attrition there. All right, I'm not going to say anything about this except that it's there. I guess the one thing that I should note is that we're talking about a sample here that is younger than the general population, and that's by design, right? Those 25 were picked because they're younger. So no one in my survey is over the age of 45. Okay, so these are the results, and I'll just sort of summarize. There's more in the paper, and I'm happy to say more on sort of how all of these things are measured. A lot of these are sort of multiple items in the survey. For people who care about these things, these are the complier average causal effects, and that is sort of trying to address the issue of non-compliance. Some people who are selected as poll workers don't show up, or say that they can't do it on that day because they're traveling, or there are valid excuses. And so that means that some of the alternates get called in to do it. Okay, but it's a small proportion, and so this sort of tries to account for that, because in the survey I asked people whether or not they did it. So what you can see here is just looking at the effects. So just comparing people who served as poll workers to people who didn't in February, and then again in June. Empowerment is a series of items. This comes from a scale in psychology on sort of sense of empowerment, and you can see that there's an increase in a sense of empowerment. At least in February, it sort of becomes less precisely estimated in June, although, to my mind, it sort of seems like it's still there, but we have this attrition issue. There does seem to be an increase in internal efficacy. And again, there's a number of survey items that are used to measure that. Trust in elections also seems to go up. Satisfaction with democracy as well, and support for democracy, those are the kind of standard items that are used to ask those questions. These are the same items that we use in the LAPOP surveys. Nothing in terms of political interest. Again, as I mentioned, maybe that's not surprising, and certainly not something that participatory theories of democracy would necessarily have predicted. And then finally, importantly, I think civic participation is a measure of how often you participate in a series of things over the last 12 months, right? So we wouldn't expect a big difference in February, right? That, in some sense, that's kind of a baseline. But by June, the people who did serve as poll workers are participating a little bit more than the people who didn't. And I think that's sort of, again, consistent with participatory theories, although, with the caveat that like now it's the middle of the pandemic and everything is online, and, so there's all sorts of things going on there. But, it is what it is. The real world is, gets in the way of our designs. Okay, and then, in the paper I say more about, other ways of measuring these things, intent to treat effects, and Heckman models to address attrition and things like that, et cetera. So, just to sum up, I think, there's some evidence here that political participation does do what these theories suggest: foster better citizens, quote unquote, better citizens. I guess I should put that in quotes. I do want to recognize that, obviously, as in any study, it's a very particular case. It's even a very particular case among Peruvian elections because it's an off-cycle extraordinary election. So, for whatever you think that's worth, to my mind, that just means we need to do more studies. But, it's always just one case. It is a form of compelled participation, and, that might matter. So that's worth keeping in mind. But, as I said, I think we need to be doing more of this kind of work. I don't think many of you here will not be surprised to hear that we need to study other forms of political participation besides voting, and Jenny's gonna lead the charge on that. I think maybe to my mind, most policy application way of thinking about this, and certainly the way that ONPE thinks about this, is that this could be one way, a small way, to help stem the decline in democratic attitudes that we've seen, not just in Peru, certainly in Peru, and more generally in Latin America, but I think even beyond that. And that's something that ONPE was very happy to see these results. Okay, I'll leave it there. Sorry, I went a couple minutes over, but look forward to your comments and to discussion.
Excellent. Thanks, Noam. I'll now introduce our three panelists who will ask their questions one after the next, and then we'll hear Noam's response to these questions all at once. So the first question is from Francisca Castro, who is a doctoral researcher at Humboldt University in Berlin and a researcher in the ERC project. Francisca.
Yeah, thanks, Jenny. So thanks, Noam, for the presentation. It was very interesting. So the paper notes that there are good reasons to think that poll workers who had negative experiences might not come away with the same attitudinal change you find in the study. And since this seems to be an important observation for the generalizability of the study's findings, I wonder if it might be possible from your data to explore whether those who had relatively negative experiences also have less positive outcomes overall. And I was wondering, maybe some irregularities are reported in electoral records that poll workers have to fill, or maybe if something is reported in the media, there could be a way to map which polling stations had these negative types of events. So I'm wondering if this could be potentially something that you're interested in doing. Thanks.
Thanks, Francisca. Now we have a question from Leah Nadan, who is a second-year BA student in our department. Leah.
Hi. So the study's very unique research design was was possible because Peru has an interesting system, like you explained, of random and mandatory assignment of citizens as poll workers. Since your research found that the system has such positive effects for important measures of democratic attitudes and behaviors, do you think that the system or something similar can be implemented in other countries that don't use that system already, or something similar?
Great. And now our final panelist question is from Amir Gara, a first-year BA student in our department. Amir.
Thank you, Jenny. And thank you, Noam. When you defined supportive participation, the paper gave two main examples of poll workers and the military service. Related to some of the work you've done on political violence, I wonder if you expect military service to have similar positive effects in all contexts, or whether the local level of political violence might influence the potential positive democratic effects of military service.
Excellent. So thanks, Francisca, Leah, and Amir, and we'll now hear Noam's responses to these questions.
Thanks so much. Yeah, those are all great observations and questions. I'll just respond to them in that order. So Francisca's question about negative experiences and or looking at sort of irregularities. My plan was to do that, to basically study whether so my expectation, I think a pretty straightforward theoretical expectation, is that positive effects would only sort of we would only expect to see positive effects where people had a positive experience, or at least a positive experience with the process that they're kind of supporting or stewarding as poll workers. So if you're observing, if you're a poll worker and what you observe is fraud or vote buying, then presumably you're not going to have this sort of more trust in the electoral institutions as a result of that. So I wasn't expecting people to observe vote buying or sort of widespread fraud in Peru, but I was expecting to have some variation. There are very, very few, it turns out, at least in this election, but I think consistently in other elections, irregularities that happen in Peruvian elections. Actually, the ONPE is widely considered to be a incredibly efficient or sort of capacious state institution in Peru. So, and that's consistent with my survey. So I asked people, in part because ONPE wanted me to ask, how their experience was, and it was overwhelmingly positive. I mean, there's almost no one in the survey who said, sort of anything negative about the experience. So my answer to your question is I just don't have very much variation. It is something that I want to continue to look at, and it is, I think, a reasonable theoretical expectation. So I have a student that I'm working with to study some of these things in Mexico potentially, although there's been some complications now with election administration in Mexico, but there is an upcoming election. There is a system that's not, entirely identical to the Peruvian system, but there is a system that would allow us to look at that. And I think there's, much more variation in Mexico, even in terms of, violence at polling places and things like that. I mean, there's just a lot more heterogeneity to allow us to study that. So so that's something that I want to look at going forward, but not something I think I can do with this particular study. Leah's question about whether this can be implemented in other countries, I think it can. I mean, I think one way to think about these findings is that we could do this same kind of poll worker kind of process in other cases, and I think that's certainly doable. Another is to sort of go even more general and say, well, I think what this shows is that these kinds of forms of participation do have these kinds of effects, and so maybe we ought to incentivize, maybe not compel necessarily, but incentivize or invest in having people participate in political processes of various kinds in this way, and that might generate sort of similar effects. So I think there's a lot of room for innovation around participation in political processes, and there are countries that are not so much countries, but subnational governments that are experimenting with these kinds of things. Lisbon has a sort of a participatory policy-making body where it randomly selects citizens to get together and advise the city council on policy. So there's all sorts of ways to do these kinds of things. I think there is some innovation, experimentation that's being done out there, and my sense is that there ought to be more. Amir, finally, Amir's question about military service, and I think this goes back to Francisca's question as well. I think the nature of someone's experience when they participate is hugely important, and here, in some sense, I've taken a pretty homogeneous set of experiences, in part because it's very prescribed what you do as a poll worker, and in part because there's just not a ton of variation in sort of what happens, and everybody's doing it on the same day, right? In other kinds of forms of participation, like maybe military service or community service, if you think of like AmeriCorps, there's going to be much more variation in people's experiences, and I do think those things matter. So certainly, military service that involves violence is going to have very, very different effects on people's attitudes. But military service that is effectively doing some sort of community service in your community, or I don't know what the Swiss military, they guard the Vatican. Those kinds of experiences presumably involve a lot less exposure to violence. So that might be more similar to these kinds of things. But that, I think, is really the next step in this kind of research agenda, is to think about what are those different circumstances, what are those different kinds of experiences where we would expect these kinds of results versus other kinds of results. Thanks for those.
Excellent. Thanks, Noam. We received a number of really interesting questions in the chat, so we'll proceed now to our second round of questions, and we'll go in the same order with the panelists. So first, Francisca.
Okay. Great. Yeah, I I had another question about the durability of the effect. So you found that the results of an empowerment and internal efficacy last, but other effects, such as opinions on whether the elections were clean or if the vote was secret, they dissipate. And I'm wondering what could be the explanation for this? So why could be the reason that this effect changed over time, given that it's something based on experience, right? So if someone asks you whether you think the vote is secret, I find it like very unlikely that you change your opinion like after a while, because it's something that you experience, but you find that that is the case. So why do you think that might be?
Okay, thanks. And to our next panelist, Leah.
You're finding that being a poll worker had several positive effects on people's democratic attitudes and behaviors made us wonder what other types of supportive political participation, such as the ones that you mentioned, might be important to research that you think haven't been studied enough yet. Yeah.
Excellent, thanks. And Amir.
Thank you. Considering the fact that political participation is central to major theories of democracy, my question is, how do you see this study affecting the way researchers usually define political participation?
Okay, thanks for these questions. And Noam, the floor is yours to answer.
Thanks. I'll go backwards this time.
And these were all super easy questions, right?
they're always super easy.
Yeah.
Amir, I guess, a sort of, if I were very ambitious, I would say that, hopefully scholars of political participation generally will sort of, take from this that there's a set of forms of participation that we have been essentially overlooking. I've tried to find studies of poll workers, poll working, and the only studies that exist out there at all are so there's I should say there's one that looks at the effects of being a poll worker in Spain that just came out I think quite recently in PSRM. Other than that, it's all sort of election administration, like legal journals, those kinds of things. So it really isn't something that political scientists have paid any attention to. And so, hopefully this suggests that we ought to be sort of thinking more about, whether or not you like my typology, that there are these sort of other things that we ought to be studying. I think that segues nicely into Leah's question about, what are the other forms of this? And again, I think there's kind of a more and a less ambitious answer to your question. I mean, when I think very expansively about what it means to participate in democratic politics, I would say that everyone who works in the state bureaucracy is participating. Now, they're getting paid and it's a job, but they are also constantly interacting with political institutions and with the state and with democratic processes. And how can that not shape the way that they think about democracy and our political institutions? And of course, right, it's going to be self-selected, and we're going to have all the sort of issues of studying that. But that seems, that's sort of secondary, right? Conceptually, it seems to me that there's a whole class of ways that people participate in our political institutions that, we just haven't paid much attention to because, I think for understandable reasons, so much of the focus is on voting, including in the definitions of democracy, the conceptions of democracy that Amir mentioned, right? When they say participation is central to democracy, they're usually talking about voting, right? Or at least, that's how they measure it. So, there's lots of ways that we've lots of things that we've overlooked. Okay, and then finally, Francisca's question about a more sort of nitty-gritty question about duration of effects. So I think the couple of outcomes that you're mentioning, I think there's sort of some revisions or fixing of some issues between the version of the paper that you're seeing and the results that I just showed you in the graph. So there were some issues with like missing data that I've addressed, but also empowerment. So the things that sort of turned out to be statistically significant empowerment and efficacy come from a series of items. And then for some reason, when I sort of did this initially, all the sort of democracy related, like trust in institutions and elections are clean, I just did single items. And so unsurprisingly, they had bigger confidence intervals. So I've actually sort of put those into, somebody, when I presented this, said, why don't you do an index on that? It might have been Jenny, actually. So I've done that, and that's why you're seeing in what I presented, some of those effects show up as statistically significant where they didn't when in the version that's in the paper. So I don't think there's big differences in sort of what lasts over time and what doesn't. If we're sort of interpreting some of those less precise estimates in June as well, we're losing almost half the sample, so it's unsurprising that it's going to be less precisely estimated, but the estimates themselves are not sort of going, down substantially. So, to me, that sort of suggests that these things do seem to be generally lasting when they're there in February as well.
Mm-hmm. We had one more nitty-gritty question that came in. I'll ask it. This came from Galbiton, and she asked if you could provide a bit more information on how civic participation is measured. Mm-hmm. Particularly, she asked the interesting question, if maybe the respondents, I hadn't thought about this when I read the paper, if maybe they thought about their work as a poll worker as their civic engagement, and that was part of their response. So sort of if your question was specific enough to exclude that indigeneity.
Right. Yeah, I think so. So it's I believe it's 5 items. It's the same battery that we've used in the Americas Barometer in the LAPOP surveys, and it's how frequently do you attend each of the following meetings of political parties, community meetings. I think there's parent associations. I forget exactly there's religious associations, not including attending mass or services, and then it's a scale that goes from I don't even remember exactly, once a week to a couple times a week, once a month. I mean, so there's some variation there. Yeah, to get more precisely to your question, it's not obvious to me how you would sort of, like I was a poll worker on election day would sort of fit into any of the categories, or sort of say, yeah, I do that more frequently because, a few months ago I was a poll worker. Yeah, so I guess I'm not super concerned that that's in there, but because of the way those questions are asked.
Great. Well, I'll make the observation to sort of wrap up, as we in the class have been reviewing not only this paper but Noam's work as a whole. A number of students in the class observed that Noam happens to seem to sort of come across experiments that he manages to study in his work. And so if you would want to add a final word or two on how did you decide to study this experiment? How did it come to you?
Yeah, so yeah, it's an interesting question about how we sort of arrive at our research questions and research projects. So so this one has a long and a very sordid history. Sorted in for me, not so much for anybody else. But so I did some work with USAID in Peru in 2013, 2014. And that work had nothing to do with poll workers and was focused on sort of anti-corruption efforts and anti-corruption program that they had. That was maybe a little bit ill-conceived, but there it was, and I was tasked with kind of trying to study the impact of this programming that they had. As part of that work, I met with folks at the election agency, and that's when I learned that this is how they select poll workers, and I thought, that's interesting. A few years later, I think so I had read some of the sort of normative theories of participatory theories of democracy and Pateman's book back in grad school, but I think it was a couple of years later that I read some of the work on jury service, and then it occurred to me that one could study these things by looking at this case in Peru, and I got really excited about doing that, and then it took 3 tries, so like something like 5 years to manage this collaboration with the election office. So I actually tried to pull off this survey 3 times, and the 3rd time was the time that actually worked. There were concerns the previous times at the last minute, usually by someone in the leadership of the election office, about the privacy of people's phone numbers, because we're we needed to have people's phone numbers to be able to call them. I didn't need the phone numbers, but the people making the calls needed the phone numbers, and we had agreements and MOUs and sort of various efforts, and I had a survey firm lined up twice, and the 2nd time actually a questionnaire was already programmed, and we had already trained interviewers when the election office decided that they didn't want to do it after all. So the 3rd time, I told them I would train interviewers, and they would go to the call center at the election office, and they would make the calls from there. And I would never see the phone numbers, and neither would any of them. And that's how that finally worked in the 2020 election. So that's the sordid history of this thing, but sort of the intellectual backstory is, I sort of knew about this case, and then later on sort of occurred to me that one could use it to answer an interesting research question that I was interested in.
Wow. Well, we're glad you persisted, and political science scholarship will be too. This is a really fascinating paper, and it's clear also from the questions in our class and in the seminar that there's going to be a line of work that's going to emerge from this. So thanks to Noam and to the panelists for leading this webinar, and to our participants for asking such great questions. We look forward to seeing you again. Our final webinar in this series is on March 6th with Professor Theda Skocpol from Harvard University on the timely topic these days of citizen organizing and partisan polarization. See you then.